In the last couple of weeks, a number of videos have been published around the topic of whether or not SwordTube is dying. Some of these have been published by some of the bigger names in the sword community, some of the legacy names in the sword community. So, for example, Metatron or Shadiversity, for instance. Others have been posted by some of the big newcomers, such as Cell Sword Arts, and then videos from smaller content creators, such as, relatively smaller compared to me, they're still really big, but such as Federico Malaguti. So I thought perhaps I'd add my 2 cents as a really small content creator, but which is still part of the sword community nonetheless. And what I'd like to focus on in this video are some points raised in the videos, especially by Cell Sword Arts and by Federico Malaguti, because I think they raised some really interesting points that kind of go beyond the observation that things are not going well for sword tubers, or at least for some sword tubers, but they really address more aspects of, let's say, cultural change, perhaps, or of YouTube changes. But then I would also like to give my opinion on a few points and also talk about why this may not be as bad a thing as it is being presented. In fact, I have to say that when I first saw the topic pop out of SwordTube is dead or dying, my first reaction was good, finally. And this isn't because I have any ill will towards any content creators. I do really hope that everyone is able to create what they want to create and what they're happy creating, and that they do find an audience for that kind of content. But I have been feeling in the last years, actually, that sword content has become a little bit stagnant in terms of its interest and its quality, perhaps. So let's quickly address a few of the points Cell Sword Arts mentioned in his video, because I think they're really interesting. Basically, his point is that there's been a change in what the consumer or the content consumer wants to watch or see. So from a pioneering generation of sword tubers who were more generalist, you could say, so approached topics in a more light-hearted fashion, not so much in the style or tone, but more in the way they approached the topic. So, you know, kind of hopscotching between historical videos, fantasy, pop culture, HEMA-ish videos, tier lists, these kinds of things. Essentially, the public enjoyed that for a while that was the content that was available, and then eventually started wanting to see things that are more specialized. And the rise of HEMA as a pretty popular activity in sports now is the catalyst, perhaps, for this change in needs, and people want to see content that is more specialized. Not only that, of course, and this doesn't relate only to SwordTube, it relates to YouTube in general, the audience wants content that is better produced. So this kind of what I'm doing here isn't anymore the what really flies on YouTube. People want to see content that has a high production value, is engaging, is interesting, is entertaining, is funny, is frequently produced or published, I mean, is regularly published. So essentially, there's a really, really high bar to kind of gain the interest or support of the viewer. And this is something Cell Sword Arts does really well, by the way. So, in fact, his video is mostly tips to creators, in a sense. So he does give a bunch of tips, whether it's focusing on shorts, some tips with insights of, you know, how things worked for them when it comes to long-form videos. This is all really cool, and I'm sure it works really well because it does work for them. They are bringing in the numbers to prove it. I just have one concern here, which is that this content also, I have the fear or feeling, may eventually become obsolete or fatigued. So in the same way as the pop culture, the generalist SwordTube vibe became a little bit not engaging or interesting, what will happen after, let's say, 1 year, 5 years, 10 years perhaps, of constant shorts, all high produced, all engaging, but the world of HEMA practicing, as far as I know it, which is not much, admittedly, but relies on a few treatises. It's not more than a few, but let's say it's not relying on some infinite amount of content that is always growing. Those are the documents we have. We can refine techniques, we can work on certain things, but essentially it is a topic that at some point risks exhausting its energy, I suppose. This is my impression. And I think about it because this is basically what happened to the pop culture generalist YouTube. So one thing that for a long time puzzled me with SwordTube, I came into it academically interested perspective, in the sense that my interest has always been on the history of swords, the real application of swords, their context, learning basically using swords as a means to understand the past in a better way. But it's swords for me, but it could be pottery for someone else. It could be antique books for someone else. It could be whatever. These are just ways to get a better connection with the past. So for me, it was really surprising to see the predominance of pop culture in the world of swords. I'd go in forums, or, well, not forums, mostly subreddit, I suppose, is where a lot of this happens, or on YouTube, you would see that as well. And everything, all the content that was being pushed the hardest around swords, with one big exception, which is Matt Easton and Scuola Gladiatoria. I think he's been doing an amazing job of maintaining a straight line, let's say, and being entertaining and still talking about lighthearted topics while still having a strong focus on history and, let's say, a certain kind of academic approach to what he does. Anyway, I was really surprised to see that most of the successful content, with the exception of Matt Easton, was very often stuff that had really nothing to do with swords. So, I mean, it has to do with swords in the sense that, yeah, they're fantasy swords, so you're talking about swords of Lord of the Rings, lightsabers, comparing video game swords, but that's not really swords, that's entertainment. But perhaps the best way I could put it is there's nothing that can grow from that kind of content, except for more speculation. But I mean, it's not going to go on for years. People aren't going to debate techniques of a sword that doesn't exist in too much depth. So what I kind of saw for a long time was a lot of content being created, which is very lighthearted, very engaging, easy to watch in the background, or when you have, when you're doing something else, you don't need to focus too much. It's not a lecture or something. It's fun. You feel like you've learned something. You feel like you come out with a better understanding of swords. But since it's in this framework of fantasy and pop culture, it's also fun and entertaining, and you can meme about it and things. But in the end, this does not, in my impression, leave you much to work with. On the other hand, an academic approach to swords never really exhausts its momentum, in a sense, because there will always be new information, new things we can learn about antique swords. There is no... And by antique swords, I don't mean only historical swords. This can even be learnings you gain through reproduction swords that are made to match antique swords. So for example, a reproduction of a Walloon hilt sword that you use for cutting can give a lot of really interesting insights. The comparison between a well-made Walloon hilt reproduction and a Polish saber, for example, can also give a lot of interesting insights on how they work, how they handle, how the weight is distributed, etc. And we do have a lot of channels that do this work. We have Delaytrix, for example, who is really, really involved in a lot of measurement work, a lot of comparison work between swords that are often accurate reproductions of historical swords. So when I say academic environment, I don't only mean books and historical swords as antique objects. I mean more of academic involvement in understanding the sword as an object. So going back to Sellsword Art's video, I think, one, there is a risk that by simply approaching this as way to boost your YouTube videos, so hey, make shorts, make them entertaining, make them engaging, and the whole list of things he says, well, it's really true. when do you have time to do your research on swords? When do you have time to, most of my time isn't making videos, for instance, it's reading books, looking at swords, handling swords, cleaning swords. And if I spent less time doing this, I wouldn't have much to say in my videos at some point. I would kind of exhaust my knowledge of what I can talk about. And I hope not for Sellsword Arts, because I really like their channel. I think it's really cool what they do. But my fear and impression is that perhaps a lot of people that maybe pick up these tips will simply adapt them and want to pump out as much content as possible in highly produced and high quality, but you will eventually run out of things to say. Another YouTuber that made a really interesting video is Federico Malaguti. And he approached it from, I think the genesis of the issue is basically the same for everyone, and I think everyone agrees. It's the shift between generalist approach to swords, very embedded in the world of pop culture and fantasy, into a need for something more niche and specific. And Federico Malaguti does a really, really good job with HEMA videos, sparring, actual sword technique videos. He also, though, brings up a further issue, which is the one of kind of niche competition and finite resource, which is the attention of the viewer. So kind of moves a little further compared to Sellsword Arts and compared to Shadiversity or Metatron that talked about the issue as well, in that it's not just an issue of what you do and how you do it and what you talk about. There's also an increasing amount of people who are creating content around these niche topics, and these points all make a lot of sense. And sorry for the bells if you hear them, I can't do anything about it. But essentially, the point I think everyone seems to agree on is that change needs to happen. Whether or not that's a change in the format, which is what Sellsword Arts suggests, or whether it can even be a change in topic, which is what Federico Malaguti talks about as well, which is the perhaps need at some point to shift away from swords as a very niche kind of topic into something that is more popular and more, and this is basically what Metatron has been doing. I wanted to add to all of this, which makes a lot of sense, just some considerations of my own. I already mentioned in a previous video that I kind of see the world of sword communities divided into three broad groups. You have the practitioner side, which is the HEMA side, essentially, for European swords at least. You have the, I call it academic side, but it's more the interest in history kind of side. And then you have the mainly pop culture, generalist sword tuber, but usually heavily shrouded in pop culture. On the one side, you have Sellsword Arts, for example, you have Federico Malaguti. In the more academic side, you have, well, the pioneer Matt Easton. And then, of course, on a way, way lower scale in the tier of creators, you have people like me, for instance. And then in the generalist side of things, you would have Scalagrim, Metatron, Shadiversity, and a whole bunch of other content creators as well. My feeling is that what is happening here is just a big shift in interest. And I think the reasons can be the algorithm, there can be a lot of reasons, of course, but one reason I see, and I think, is that pop culture, at least as far as it relates to swords, may have simply exhausted its steam. Another aspect, I think, and this connects to pop culture more in general, is that the world of pop culture seems to have become rather controversial and toxic in many ways. So a lot of topics have just become basically big fights. I don't know, I'm not really involved into it, but I do see thumbnails and titles, and I am like tangentially involved, I suppose. It just seems like it's lost a lot of the fun that I think is what drove people to it 10 years ago, 50, or has been drawing people to it for decades. And it's just became really, really exhausting and tiring. And so I think that a lot of the channels or a lot of the content that was so heavily intertwined with pop culture is also suffering from that viewer fatigue, or that just, okay, I don't want to deal with this anymore. In this environment of fatigue around one topic of the heavily related to swords, now you suddenly have the rise of HEMA. But the rise of HEMA doesn't come out of nowhere. It's not discipline that is born online. It's something that is born in clubs, in physical environments. It's people training. And in the last 20 years or more, you've had HEMA develop into federations. They have clubs all over the world, even in smaller towns. And I think this is kind of the drive that's really giving momentum to channels like Sell Sword Arts or other HEMA-related channels. It's the fact that so many people are actually doing it in real life. Just imagine football. If football is popular because everyone plays it at some point in their life. Everyone's been on a football pitch, even if it's just, you know, your neighborhood pitch, or even if it's just a field. You've kicked the ball, you've hopefully hit a goal or something. So you know, it's something you can relate to. If people were just talking about stats and football in like the ether, I don't think a lot of people would be as interested as they are. And it's the same thing for swords, I think. More and more people are practicing martial arts, more and more people are having hands-on experience with swords, and that translates into an interest in the techniques and into the things that have to do with the martial art. So overall, I don't think there's anything unnatural about this kind of decline of the old guard of SwordTube. I mean, I'm sorry for them if they're losing revenue. Of course, this is never nice for anyone, but I just feel it's a very natural process in the kind of great scheme of things. And where does this leave the academic side of SwordTube? Because we've had, you know, one big empire kind of collapse, one is on the rise. And academic YouTube, I think, just kind of stays at the bottom layer. That is because intrinsically it's a drier kind of topic to address. I don't think most people have the deep interest in, you know, really detailed definitions or nerding out on the shape of a tip or the reason why a certain guard is made in a certain way or markings and these things here. But there are certain people that do. If you're watching this video, you're probably one of us. That is to say that I don't think there's ever going to be a rise of the academic side of SwordTube, but I also don't think there needs to be a rise of academic SwordTube to, you know, the top tier of content production. I think the majority of people who create the kind of in-depth, well-researched or, you know, historically focused type of content do it because of passion. So I can't imagine, you know, the Latrex, he is testing a million different swords because he charts them all, he has spreadsheets, he makes his graphs and everything, and that's what he likes to do. He would be doing it probably with YouTube or without. And the same goes for me. I collect swords on my own. I just think it's useful and interesting to show them and to talk about them, but if I didn't make videos, that would be perfectly fine. One thing I'd also like to mention about Sell Sword Arts video is when he talks about the viewer. So a lot of his video are tips for content creators, but he also mentions the needs viewers have. And as I mentioned before, these are engagement, being entertained, videos that are consistently funny, frequently published, and so on. Making videos of this quality, high production value, is a full-time job. And I say this because researching and looking into swords is something that takes a lot of time as well. So I think while this is a topic that content creators need to think about and adapt if they want their content to, it's also an important topic for you, the consumer, to think about, because there's a balance of resources essentially, and how you distribute those resources is going to determine the quality of the content you engage with. So sure, you can have top produced content which is engaging and frequent and funny and well scripted, but that is probably going to come at the cost of research and insights and deep new information that, unless the content creator has a whole team that is able to, you know, work as a full-on production studio essentially, you will not be able to have. On the other hand, you may have to watch something that is this, someone speaking in their room, to get maybe some information that you would not be able to have otherwise. So this is not to say that my approach is better or worse than any of the others. Everyone does their own thing, but it's important for you, the viewer, I think, to keep in mind that you're always making some level of compromise. So with all that out of the way, is SwordTube dying? Maybe. The SwordTube as we know it probably is. If not dying, it's deflating, maybe. But this is not a bad thing, because it means that new faces are emerging, new trends are coming out, and we'll have to see how these develop, grow, and eventually also fade out, because most things do. And by the way, my feeling and impression is that the academic side of SwordTube may never really hit big numbers, but at the same time I may be completely wrong. Matt Easton is literally a living exception to what I'm saying, although you could say that for him, the fact of being one of the pioneers of SwordTube is what really led to his numbers. But he's not seeing that decline that a bunch of other SwordTubers are seeing. But there's also a lot of other content creators, not related to swords, but that make really, really academic and really, really nerdy content. And they seem to be doing really well. So just a couple of examples I can think of right now is in the world of antique music, you have this creator, Faria Faraji, I think. I'm not sure how it's pronounced. But he makes some really cool musical composition based on an accurate and, I suppose, philological interpretation of music styles from the past. He also does really cool talks about music history. And he has hundreds of thousands of views per video, for instance. And another one that comes to mind is World of Antiquity, for example. He talks a whole bunch of, well, ancient history. So if you want to learn about, Mesopotamian cultures and Sumerian cultures and pyramids and a bunch of cool controversies around them as well, he also does really well for himself. So maybe this is something to think about for the people like me who are trying to do the academic side of content, and is how can we improve what we do to make it more engaging and more interesting while still not sacrificing the depth of information we try to give. So I'll kind of end this video with an open question to all of you guys, and it's, what do you think could be done better in the segment of like the educational sword content? What would you like to see? What would you like to learn? And what can I, or the people that make videos like mine or like me, do maybe have a better chance at being competitive as much as the pop culture and HEMA side of the SwordTube community. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon in another sword video.